that I chose, but it was something that I said you might be able to share on something that you feel you'd have some insight into. So why did you pick a topic like this?
Yeah, so I'm a physician who deals a lot with cancer patients and have worked a lot in disaster zones, and I guess have seen suffering at the coalface, as they say, which is what the viewer from the coalface. And I normally talk about science and faith, which because I'm a scientist, talk about that. I talk a lot about parenting and fathering, which is a big thing that I am involved in. And what else do I talk about? There's one other thing. Oh, leadership, that's right. I knew that. But yeah, so I'm a clinician at Charlie's. I run a research team as well, also director on the Fathering Project. Okay, so why did I choose that subject? Because it's the hardest one to talk about, without a doubt. And I am no special genius about this. It's just that I live at the coalface and people like to hear what I've got to say, that's all. No one special, and I do talk about it differently to other people. So I warn you, I do talk about this issue differently to other people. So if you've ever heard it before, whatever, you can take me or leave me. It's just my perspective on it. That's why it says a view from the coalface.
Yep, well, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to...
Oh, nice short intro, thanks, yeah. So I hate these introductions usually, but that was a good one, thanks. Usually they say lies about me or it feels like it's somebody else. Now, I'm just going to check if there's a clock around that I can look at. I've got a phone, but it's kind of running out of... So look, pretty small group, so I'm going to get you to do some stuff to talk about some things a bit later. But there's three parts to this talk. The first is I am going to talk about suffering to set the scene. I'm going to focus on natural disasters because that's where the innocent really suffer big time, and that's the sort of innocent suffering as emblematic of the issue. But I'm a bit nervous, to be honest. I'm never nervous when I talk, but there's two things that make me nervous talking about suffering. One is, everyone suffers. Probably everyone in this room has had some suffering to a greater or lesser extent. Hey, I live in that world and I hate talking about suffering other than to weep with those who weep. I was asked to talk in Sydney. I was talking about this last week to someone in Sydney. They asked me to give a talk at the Centre for Public Christianity, or they video you. And it was just after I got back from my first or second trip to Aceh after the tsunami. And he said, oh, well, what do you do? And I said, well, it's really important to weep with those who weep and to help people and be kind. And he said, but what about the theological explanation? And I said, oh, it doesn't help people. In fact, it hurts them when you try to give them that. And he said to me, well, you've got to give it to us because we're on the video. And I said, no, I can't do it. I was still too raw from that experience, and I just know that it doesn't help, and in fact it hurts. So I'm nervous because people come to these talks because often they have a deep sense of suffering and pain, and just want to honour those people in the room who might be in that situation. What's the second reason? Oh, because I'm talking about suffering from the coalface, right? So I've got to warn you, I need to take you to the coalface. This is not an armchair discussion about the intellectualisation and theologicalisation of suffering. It is quite visceral. And I do that because one of the key points about Christianity and suffering is that God enters into the suffering. It's not airbrushed out and it's not, she'll be right, mate. God enters into it. And so for us to think about it, we have to enter into it. So I'm nervous because some people don't like to hear about suffering in its reality. So I guess there's two main sorts of suffering we think about. By the way, you can interrupt me any time, I think. One is that brought about by human beings and terrorism, murder, child abuse, very much in the headlines now, genocide. Brought about by human beings, and I think think you can sort of imagine that there's an explanation for that, but I think what gets people's goat is the stuff that would be called acts of God. So famine and starvation, kids, or anyone with cancer, kids with cancer in particular, always gets to me. There's earthquakes, locked out. Earthquakes, volcanoes, that's Mount St. Helens, so-called acts of God. So maybe I'll start, I'll introduce you to somebody who we'll talk about later. This is Shia, 13-year-old kid who I met in Indonesia. Shia's a kid who, he's got a dad and he's got a sister. His mum sadly died of illness the year before I met him. Loves soccer. Lovely kid. We'll come back and talk to Shia later on. Do you know, a beautiful world we live in. It's a beautiful world. It's just, and every astronaut that goes up in space and looks at us, it's just a beautiful thing in the dark sky. And it's got this thin atmosphere, very thin when you look at the Earth, and it's a wonderful thing that enables us to live. It's a very rare thing. In fact, it's miraculous that we even have a fine-tuned universe that would enable the Earth to exist. But it's not perfect in the sense that this atmosphere can let sunshine through and it can mutate your DNA and give you cancer. And you've got all these beautiful planets, all beautifully organised and some ocean, and they've kind of drifted across the surface of the Earth, but you know, there's a few tectonic plates which only have to shift 10 or 20 metres to cause a massive earthquake. And if it's in the ocean, a tidal wave. And in Boxing Day 2004, that's what happened off the coast of Indonesia. Massive tidal wave, or earthquake followed by a tidal wave. So the closest town was the town of Mulabo. This is a promontory on the town of Mulabo, just to give us some idea. So the tidal wave, this is the closest point to the epicentre, Mulabo. Wave came in and then it sort of wrapped itself around this 15 metres high, and so here's the pre-existing town. This is there's a soccer pitch in here where Shia and his mates love to play soccer. Just to give us some idea of the power of this tsunami, this is a satellite image taken straight afterwards. Everything smashed, and this is what it looked like on the ground. And you can see this building did survive, but the wave just blasted through there, including the top story. Wave was as high as this tree. And you know, a wave isn't like a wave at the beach, a dumper. A wave is like a slab of water that just is a slab that just keeps coming and coming and coming, which is why it smashed this town for about 3 kilometres. So you wonder why kids don't swim, but this is why you can't swim through a tsunami. This is a picture of the tsunami going through the streets of Monroe, full of wood and mud, and people inhale that mud and the wood knocks them out of them. It's awful. Of course, we know about, also it affects tourists, of course, and is a tourist restaurant, and it's when tourists are affected that really the media take hold. And we know all about it. So, so Shia was playing soccer with his mates when the tsunami hit, and he described how, and his mate, who used to come to our tent and get what's called sisa sisa. They were living on the street, and we used to give them sisa sisa, which is leftovers, but it wasn't leftovers, we just made food for them every day. They could really eat too. And he hung onto a tree, he survived, got back home. His dad was dead and so was his sister, right? He's now an orphan. That's why he was living in the street. Now, I told you I was going to confront you a little bit about suffering, and again, I don't apologise for this because God enters into our suffering. This is one of those curious things about discussing Christianity and suffering. So, Shia's dad and sister they lived near the ocean. That's why he was playing there. They were washed out to sea, and tide brought bodies back in again. Some of them up onto the beach. 200,000 people died in Aceh from this tsunami. A bit over, actually. And it's pretty horrible. It's very horrible and confronting for everybody. But you don't go there to help because of 200,000 people dead. You go because there's 1 million people who are sad and they've got no health care, they've got no food, they've got no nothing. So you show compassion and you go there to help because of the survivors. The grief is the ones who suffer from these disasters, if you like, are the survivors. And, pictures say it all. 1 million people. So I was at home and I read in the newspaper after Boxing Day that around 3,000 people were thought to have died at that stage. And I went on down south on our Scripture Union Beach mission and thought that's a real shame. But I was writing the newspaper for the beach mission, so I was keeping an ear on the news. When it got to 60,000, I thought, oh, this is terrible, 60,000 people dead. But it was a story about all the kids who were made orphans like Shia that broke my heart. Because kids can swim and their parents, and we're talking grandparents, parents, aunts, everybody, they all live in the same part, so everyone's wiped out. So I volunteered. I walked down to the beach and I looked over the ocean and I thought, if the earth wasn't curved and I could see far enough, I'd actually be able to see Aceh because that is our neighbour. Down in southwest Sumatra, they're our neighbours. So I thought, love your neighbour. And they are fundamentalistically Muslim, I should say, too, in Aceh. I'm a Christian man and I'm going to go. So long story about how I got to go, but I went. Couldn't go for 6 weeks because I had to learn Indonesian, which is, in order to work at the Coalface rather than in the sort of Western compound, you had to sort of learn Indonesian. Another story, but anyway, I did. And indeed, I ended up in that town of Malabo that I just told you about. There's the epicentre. And there's where the tsunami hit in Aceh. Banda Aceh, which is more famous. And I worked, really was based here, but up and down the coast on 5 different visits. I was lucky enough to work with an Indonesian team. You can see this big, tall, white guy with all these Indonesians. 120 in the end, Indonesians and 1 Westerner. And again, another story. This is not about me. This is about human suffering, right? So this is not a travel log. We flew around in helicopters. And this is Dr. Carla. She was the boss of the team. She was the first doctor into Banda Aceh. 48 hours after that tsunami, she landed. They drove around the bodies they found a garage that was still intact. They got patients, from the first night, they had patients lying in this garage with intravenous going in, where she worked from 6 a.m. to midnight every day. Not good practice, to be honest, but she was just a caring Christian doctor, a wonderful lady, and here she is talking about stuff. This is a town that was smashed. So when you get there, you see this sort of stuff. People's clothes, nothing's cleaned up, so you can just see they were living, clothes smashed. And it's pretty moving because you see tricycles in the mud and broken, and you can just imagine the kids riding them. Kettles. People were just living. It was Sunday morning. Was it Saturday morning? I think it was a Sunday morning. It was about 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, and people like Shia were out and about. Anyway, you don't sit around feeling shocked by the damage, nor do you sit around just feeling sad for people. You get on and do stuff. And so I worked as a doctor. It's a kid with pneumonia, terrible pneumonia. A lot of pneumonia there after the tsunami. I showed you the water full of cow dung and everything. They used to get these terrible pneumonias, but when I was there, most of it was just ordinary pneumonia. But again, it's not about me. I just went as a doctor and helped. Here's a place called Lokrut. This is our medical tent and dental tent. There's the pharmacy tent, and there's stuff, UNHCR tents. The whole town was completely smashed. And this is interestingly, this is a mosque that was smashed. And our team, which was a Christian team, Indonesian Christian team, rebuilt the mosque for them. I think it's kind of a nice thing. But this place looks pretty peaceful, but it was shockingly hot. A few months ago, Jack and I had a holiday and we had a swim, then went to the sauna. I sat in that sauna, you know what a sauna feels like, and I just suddenly went back to Lockroot. It was that terrible, the conditions. Anyway, that was 5 visits to Aceh, but I also went to Sumatra after the Padang earthquake, and you can see this is the health centre at the back here, all smashed, and that's why you go, because the health services are smashed, the hospitals get smashed, and the doctors, well, half the doctors and nurses were killed by the tsunami, so a lot of disease, and yet no one to help them. Here I am being a paediatrician. Also went to Haiti after the earthquake, not for a long time. 250,000 died there as well. So, you know, you go there to help the survivors, which is what I just mentioned. Actually, to be perfectly honest, when we started off, we'd be doing all these clinics, seeing hundreds of patients a day. And we didn't want to ask them about their tsunami kind of experience because we felt a bit like intrusive. So I was the only Westerner, but the rest were all Indonesians, but they don't sort of want to invade their space. But then we had a team meeting, and it turns out they couldn't talk to each other about it because everyone's lost somebody. So someone's lost 3 kids, someone's lost 4 kids, someone's lost 2 kids and a wife. I mean, we realised we had to do the talking. We had to sort of start talking about it to help them to sort of deal with it. And then we sort of took the sadness. Swam, grabbed a tree, lucky. But look, I just mentioned another thing about this is the people who go there. I mean, people say, "Oh, you must have been exciting." But here's a worker. Look at all the bodies. Look at the look on her face. I say this because the day I got back, I guess it was a Saturday night. On Monday morning, I went to work, and I'm not criticising anyone. Right? I was totally raw. First trip. The first of the 5. One of the secretaries said, "Did you have a good time in Aceh?" And I'm not, she's not someone who knows about what it's like. And this is the same for police or soldiers. If you don't tune into what it's really like, you're probably going to say the wrong thing, and they'll never share with you again. So I put this picture there because obviously not everyone who goes there is a Christian. They're just good people. Christians are overrepresented, but, it's the same. It's just, this is sort of difficult. And I say that because if you know anyone who works in those difficult coalface professions, I was talking to a paediatric oncology nurse today about who cares for her and her team when kids die of cancer, when they've been loving them and caring for them. Try to be aware of all of this. Thought I'd just slip that one in.
Have you had any impact with post-traumatic stress as a result of all these volunteer trips we've been doing?
No, I think I was... not really. I still feel it, as you can tell, but no. But I think Dr. Carla... So the Indonesians don't talk... it's not a cultural thing for them to sort of do what the Westerners do, which is to screen people beforehand and meet regularly and then debrief at the end. So we didn't do any of that. But we did have quite a good... You saw a picture of me at the beach, etc. We did have quite a good way of making sure we stopped working, all sorts of things. Not really. I think it's touched my heart, but not in that way. But Dr. Carla, I just told you that she was the first doctor in there and was working, 6 a.m. till midnight. What's that? 18 hours a day, is that right? And I got quite close to her. And on about my 3rd or 4th visit, she and I were walking along the beach in Banda Aceh, and I I thought, I'll just ask her about it. And I said, what was it like for you? What was it like for you being the first in and having to drive your car around all the bodies? And then working 18 hours a day. What was it like? And I said, did you have anyone sort of caring for you? And she just broke down and wept. First person who'd ever asked her. And I think that's a really important thing about this. Anyway, now it's come. That's enough about that particular. That's just an example, right? It's an example, and I wanted you to enter into that suffering so that you could feel a bit of what it's like. Oh, I should say something else. I do hear, I feel bad because I'm going to be sounding judgmental, but you do hear people talking about suffering from their armchairs. And I listen to it and I think, I don't think you've ever seen it in its depths and horror. That's what I feel anyway. That's what I feel. So that's why talking from the coalface is a little bit different. Anyway, now I'm going to get you to do some work and I'm going to give you 3 frequently asked questions. I'm going to get you to talk about them and I'll just tell you how I'm going to do it. One thing that people think is that we deserve the suffering we're experiencing. As a disabled child, but someone had an affair or they embezzled some money or they whatever, so they're getting payback. And let me just say, the Muslims in Aceh felt that. Because apparently, well, obviously they weren't there anymore, but apparently there were some bars along the waterfront. And this is a place that has Sharia law. And a lot of them thought that this was Allah giving them what they deserve. And let me just say completely clearly right now, I'm not someone who criticises Islam. I mean, that's there. Obviously, I've got plenty of friends in Indonesia. I'm happy to talk about how different Islam is, but I'm not someone who wants to run around criticising it all the time. Nevertheless, that's what they felt they got, what they deserved. But I know Christians who think that too. Something's happened. Huh?
Who said that publicly about that event? Christians said it.
Yeah. Anyway, another question is, now this is a big one. The existence of suffering is a knockdown argument against the existence of a loving God. And the third question is, or comment, Christians only serve in disaster zones to proselytise. They don't really care. They're really going out there to convert people, and they don't achieve much. Anyway, so here's your task. I want you to think about how much you hold each of those views, but it's not going to be a yes-no. It's got to be on a scale of 0 to 100. So, for example, if you think that we deserve the suffering we're experiencing, if you're 100% certain, give yourself 100. If you think you're absolutely not, so give yourself 0. But if you're 50-50 on it, give yourself 50 or 25, 75, whatever. Okay, because I want to get a sense of what people think about these questions, people who are here. Okay, now I want you to spend a few minutes talking to the people at your table, or you can talk to yourself there, you might talk to these ladies here, and I'm going to ask you what your score is, because I'm going to bet there's a range of scores in the room. Okay, I'll give you just 4 minutes. There you go, away you go. So look, thanks everyone for joining in. Actually, some tables have got a lot more people, so you might not have gone through them all, but let's see how we went. So, we deserve the suffering that somehow it's payback, somehow it's justice. Who gave themselves 100, score of 100? Who gave themselves, between 5 and 50 and 100? That is, you think, yeah, maybe there's... Okay. Yeah, so there's, 75, yeah. So who gave themselves 0? Okay, so there's a bit of a hunch that maybe the majority of people think that there's some sort of payback.
Not so much payback, there's consequences of not doing what God has told us to do, and then you get something happens to you, and then it's your own fault.
Yeah. Sorry, that's a good point. I should have clarified. We're not talking about if you smoke, you get lung cancer. We're talking about, in Aceh, for example, a kid who's playing soccer is getting payback. So how many zeros? Just It's a good thing I'm not writing referendum questions, isn't it? It'd probably be a province of New Zealand or something. Let's say I did a better intro for number 2. Well, this is an obvious one. This is the big complaint out there. And, I wouldn't score 0 myself for this in terms of how I feel people can respond. But anyway, who scored 100? Who scored between 50 and 100? Who scored 0? Oh, who scored 0 to 50 then? See, I'd have scored 0 to 50. I feel like, well, actually, again, this is a bad question because I got the word knockdown there, which means it doesn't allow a lot of flexibility. Another bad question. Again, it would probably be some province of Fiji if it was left to me on question 2. So I think it's reasonable to hold a view. So when people say, this is my whole experience of people talking about suffering and God, it's almost never an intellectual discussion they're looking for. It's a visceral discussion. And I was thinking about this recently. Charles Darwin of evolution, etc., held a sort of a view of God. His 10-year-old daughter, whom he completely adored, got sick. They're not sure if it was TB or something else, but they took her to a health spa out on the west side of England there, Bath or somewhere. So I don't know exactly where. Anyway, she ended up dying. And he wrote just how embittered he was and how it was just the most awful thing in his whole life. And I do find that when people, and quite reasonably, get angry at God. So I don't score 0 for this. Anyway, number 3. Christians go to proselytise, don't achieve much. Who scored 100? Who scored 50 to 100? Who scored 0? So you all got a bit of a hunch that... I think this is a bit of a tricky one because Christians do want to share their faith. I'll tell you something interesting about Aceh. So I just told you I was with a Christian team, but I didn't know they were a Christian team. I just went... basically, I tried to go with the government, but no criticism intended, but I ran into a bunch of Sir Humphreys, where in the fullness of time a subcommittee will be formed to consider a green paper and then possibly consider the possibility that... Anyway, I rang Canberra and they said, "You're never going to go, mate." I had a friend there. So I got a businessman who knew someone and said, got me onto this Indonesian team. It turns out they were Christians. Indonesian Christians. 16% of Indonesia is Christian, and not a well-known fact. They didn't know I was a Christian, I didn't know they were. But here's the thing. They're Christians in a fundamentalistically Muslim territory. Not only can you not preach anything or mention the word Jesus, you cannot even sing a song in your house. So no proselytization is possible. So if this were true, they'd have packed their bags up and gone. So when the operational manager flew in, I asked him about it. He said, "Well, we just want to show the love of Jesus." He said, "They've never met Christians, right? So we're just out there helping. We just show the love of Jesus. Can't mention Jesus at all." And it's like anyone. If they like it, they can ask questions later on. And if they don't, fine. It's about informed consent. You just say, "Well, we're just being Jesus," and you take it or leave it. And interestingly, as all the foreign aid workers packed up and flew back to Baltimore and Vancouver and London, they were still there. And a year later, they were still there serving the people. Very impressive. And like I said to you before, they rebuilt the mosque in Lockrute next to the hospital tent. Very impressive. Yeah. And I don't know about the not achieving much. I used to think, look, because there's patients everywhere, and you'd sit down and you're seeing hundreds of patients. They're pouring into your tent. And I knew there were millions of people there, so I used to think sometimes I wasn't achieving much. But when I was a medical student, I heard a phrase. I'm sure you've heard it. Maybe you haven't. It's a beautiful phrase. And it's, I don't even know where it comes from. But it's the phrase goes, better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. And what's beautiful about that is you just do it, right? And then you got 100 people who are lighting candles, and now you've got a lot of light. Then you've got 1,000, you've got a lot of light. Anyway. And I'll tell you the other thing. I wasn't going to say this, but just cropped up. I went to a WHO meeting. So WHO coordinate all the aid organisations. They did a brilliant job. But they tend to sort of work from their headquarters. And this Indonesian team, they are seriously at the coalface, sleeping in tents, and when helicopters land, clipboards, they take off again, get the numbers, but these guys are still there. Anyway, I had this WHO meeting, and I went with one of the Indonesian young doctors, but she wasn't confident in her English, so she asked me to speak on behalf of the team. Anyway, they're going around the table, and all the heavy hitters are there. MSF and blah-de-blah-de-blah, going around the table about what they're doing. So I said, well, I'm just representing this Indonesian team. I said, we got this triage tent at the hospital, outside the hospital zone. We see 680 patients a day. We've got this mobile clinic. We go to 5 different places, see about 500 a day. We've got clinics in Chalang and Lockrute, seeing whatever. We're also building fishing boats, and got this program. And their jaws are dropping, hitting the table at this group of people. Not me, just all these wonderful Christian people have landed there and just achieving a lot. That's my point.
Compared to some of the other NGOs, Brucey?
2 things, Pedro. One is, I didn't see them all, but I had a pretty good look at them. One is they were seriously at the coalface, and you don't have to be a Christian to do this, let me be clear. Peace Corps workers and all sorts of people are very dedicated, but in Lockrute, helicopter lands, you get your clobber and you work in the tent and you sleep. You actually sleep. So just how hard this is. I told you it was terribly hot and unpleasant. I mean, incredibly hard. There was a war zone. There was a war on at the time, the GAM separatists, and the battle line was like right next to where we were working. And I was working here and the dentist was working there, and when it came time to sleep, she just put a mosquito net over a dental chair and slept in the dental chair, and I just had to sleep on the camp stretcher. Anyway, the point is, it was at Coalface. These guys were seriously at the coalface where it was uncomfortable and difficult, and a lot of the other ones a little bit comfy. I just say that without wanting to be critical. It sounds critical, but you asked me the question, so I'm trying to give an honest answer. Everyone has their role, but anyway, seriously at the coalface. The second thing is, actually it relates to question 2, bad as that question was. The existence of suffering is a knockdown argument against God. Christians are always overrepresented in these places. Just as they are, and I've travelled all around the world visiting places, just as they are in jungles of South America and, upper Thailand and the deserts etc. There's Christians working in hospitals and clinics and public health and education all over the world at the coalface. Here's my point. If seeing that suffering was a knockdown argument against Christianity, they would be on the first plane out of there. But Christians are there. It cannot be a knockdown argument when they are overrepresented. That's my point. So now I'm going to do what I told you before I hate doing, which is to say, how do Christians understand suffering? Just to be clear again, I don't like doing it because I find that people who suffer find this great. But anyway, you've asked me to do it, so I'm going to do it. Now this is my understanding, of course, you may not agree. It's what I call the 5 ins. The 5 ins. That my understanding of what the Bible says about suffering. The first is, and they're all really unsatisfactory. The first is that suffering is inevitable. Just the way it is. From Genesis to Revelation in the Bible, suffering happens, and it's all biblical people are experiencing it in spades, and they're complaining about it. And it's very clear, God says you're going to suffer. That's just the way it is. And when I was a kid, probably like all kids, I learnt Psalm 23, walking through the valley of the shadow of death. And when I became a Christian later on, I thought, well, how come, if that's the valley of the shadow of death, why isn't there a sign that says, that God puts a sign there saying, valley of the shadow of death, 5 kilometres ahead, take exit 5 to avoid. It's just like, that's just what's going to happen. And there's lots of other verses about it, earthquakes are all going to happen. But if you think that's not curious enough, I've got to say too, they're called acts of God, earthquakes, etc. They're not acts of God. God does not make them happen. But here's the other thing which I mentioned right at the beginning, which is why I showed you those pictures from Aceh, is that if you think allowing suffering's kind of a bit of a weird notion, God actually enters into the suffering. It's kind of strange when you think about it, but God always enters into the suffering. Now, let me give you the best example of that. And it has to do with kids dying. Like I think about, who's got kids here? Just put your hands up. Yeah, so most people. I don't know about you, but I always thought the death of one of my kids would be the worst thing that could happen. There's lots of things can happen. You break your leg, whatever, but, if one of my kids had died, I used to think, could I survive this? Anyway, I watched this movie when the kids were little, Gallipoli, with these 2 young guys and came out. Who's seen the movie Gallipoli? Yeah, they come out of the trenches and one of them gets, they're just young kids. They don't even know who the Turks are and vice versa. And I walked out of the cinema and I thought, I was in a movie, and then I suddenly thought, I've got 2 boys, 2 sons. Imagine if it was them. I started to weep. Again, thinking about what it would be like to lose a son in a war, innocent. Then I remembered that God did exactly that. And not just death of his son himself, but the most agonizing suffering. He entered into it. Go figure. And it's not like it was all comfy and anaesthetised. Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Anyway, it is inescapable. God enters into it. He understands it. That's the first thing. The second, also very highly unsatisfactory. It is incomprehensible. So if you've come here tonight to hear Bruce Robinson giving his lecture on exactly why it is mathematically watertight why suffering occurs, it won't happen. Because the Bible clearly says it is incomprehensible. And there's a famous phrase, old phrase, we see through the glass darkly. Or more accurately, and this is, now we see things imperfectly like puzzling reflections in a mirror, but then we will see everything in perfect clarity. We will not understand this in this life. So when someone gets angry with God, you can't explain it to a satisfactory level. It is incomprehensible. And if they don't like that, then that's why they're not going to vote 0 on that scale. Here's how I think what the Bible means. At this stage, so when I was a kid, I used to watch, when finally we got a television, that's how old I am, there was an artist who used to draw these funny things. He said, I'm going to tell you kids how you're going to go to school tomorrow, a new way to go to school. And he would draw all these things, right? And he's got this, what looks like upside down one wheel. Kids are thinking, how am I possibly going to get to school on that? And then there's this thing, it's all broken up. Trust me, this is how you're going to get to school tomorrow. And then he did something, because we realised these were 4 separate things, and he rotated them around, and we realised what he'd done. And the point is, you don't know till afterwards. That's the point of that verse. It's incomprehensible, but you have to accept that it's incomprehensible at this point in time. Just the way it is. I stuck this in because of what we were talking about. The first disaster I ever went to was Cyclone Tracy, 1974, Christmas Day. And the details don't matter about that, but there was one guy who said this to me. He was about early 30s, he was working up there. He said that when the cyclone hit his room, I'm not sure where he was staying, but he could see the big window bending in and bending out with the pressure changes. And he thought, this is going to blow. So he pulled the wardrobe out and hid behind the wardrobe, between the wardrobe and the wall. And sure enough, bang, the glass smashed and stuff went everywhere, but he was safe. But outside there's stuff flying around everywhere and banging and, tin and cars. And he said he got his fist like this, and I won't tell you the words he used about God, but he was very angry at God and shouted at God for letting this happen. And then I met another guy who's he had his wife and 2 kids. I think it was 2 kids, might have been 3, can't remember. But they had under their house a sort of a brick toilet kind of toilet laundry area. So they went down into that, and the house fell down around them, and they survived. And he said, "Thank you, God." Same cyclone, different response. I've thought about that a lot because I see, if you look at like Aceh, I'm up there, I'm deeply moved by the things that I've shown you. And I say, thank you, God, for the privilege of helping these people. Someone else says, there can't be a God that would let this thing happen. I guess I'm just allowing for the fact that if people are here who don't hold this view, it's not an unreasonable view from an emotional point of view. So this is a concept that I want to I found this concept also very helpful. I heard this concept when I was in England. It's actually a concept spoken by someone 400 years ago, 350 years ago. But it's a concept that has helped me a lot to understand the limits of what we know. And then, do you stop there, or can you take a plunge of faith and realise that there's more to it? And here's the I'm illustrating it, hopefully this will work. Where reason can only wade, that is, your feet are on the ground, faith can swim. But if you want your feet to be on the ground and you don't have the courage to swim, to take the plunge, you never know. So in science, this is the case. You can only get to a certain point with rationality and evidence and all that sort of stuff. At that point, you have to choose. Do I take the plunge, or do I turn around and go back again? And it's only, here's the point, when you take the plunge, it's only when you actually take the plunge that you realise you don't actually sink to the bottom. And there's a thing called epistemology, which is how you know stuff. And there's clear epistemological evidence that if you swim, it's only when you take the plunge that you know. That's the point. This is like a scientific thing, not a religious thing. If you don't take the plunge, you don't know. That's the point. And I think suffering and this notion that God, that it's incomprehensible, but that God has that there is a reason for it, like that little bicycle, is a question of faith. You either take the plunge to there or you don't. Number 3, the third in is you're innocent. It is not your fault. This to me is 0 on the scale. There's quite a bit in the Bible, I think, that says that. If a child is born with a defect, it's not because you did something beforehand. That is absolutely not in the Bible. Someone tried that on Jesus. The guy was born blind. Well, who sinned? His parents? And Jesus said, neither the man nor his parents sinned, but it so the works of God might be displayed in him. And there's a lot of that stuff in Job as well. I mean, this is not, and again, no criticism of Islam, but the notion that Allah would wipe out Aceh because there were some bars on the edge of some bars there, like I told you. It's definitely not a Christian view. That's not the God that I believe in. That's not the God that I understand from the Bible. So the third in is that you are innocent. It's not your fault, unless, of course, you do smoke or you get drunk and go through a red light and hit someone. I'm not talking about that. That is, though, the view of Hinduism. In Hinduism, it's someone's fault. That's what's called karma, right? So someone, your parents, another life, whatever, it's the sum of the good and the bad. So if you've done bad stuff, it comes back to bite you. So it's a Hindu phrase. Again, I'm not criticising Hinduism, but it is different to Christianity. Don't make that mistake. The fourth in is the notion of indifference. People say, well, if God allows suffering, he obviously doesn't care. And here's the funny thing about, I mean, if you think it's hard to understand that God has set the world up where suffering is inescapable and then has made it incomprehensible. Why then does he weep over it all? And there's no shortage of information that God, Jesus, weeps, feels compassion, cries when he sees bad stuff. Now, I'll take that any day. Okay, it's hard to understand why God allows suffering, sure. But it's nice to know that he weeps over it. Makes him feel a bit powerless, sound a bit powerless. That's not the way it is, but I'll take it ahead of atheism. Here's a classic phrase from Richard Dawkins. If you suffer, bad luck. Bad luck. There is no God. The universe is blind, pitiless, and indifferent. It's just the world, the universe doing what it does. People live, they die, the strong, the weak. Stop complaining. It's just the universe doing its thing. You have no grounds for complaint. Bad luck. The universe is blind, pitiless, and indifferent. That is not the Christian view of God, who weeps. And God asks us as Christians to weep too. Here's the lady I showed you before. Weep with those who weep. And as I said at the very beginning, my driving principle is this. My understanding of the Christian response, exactly what I said about Aceh. They don't proselytise. They just weep with those who weep. Show the compassion, just like Jesus reached out in compassion and wept and helped people. That's the driving force for this team in Aceh. The fifth in, and the final in, is about hope, and that is that we are indestructible in this life or the next. And just going back to Psalm 23, I'll fear no evil now. And I just want to address this one here, which is a famous verse that says, in all things God works for the good of those who love him, like he makes them pull together for good. I just need to be clear that not all things are good, just that God can make them work together for good. I think there's a mistaken view that some things are good because it's God's plan, it's his blueprint, and you should just accept it because that's God's will. I don't think the Bible says that. Lots of bad things are not God's will, just he can make them work together for good. We're indestructible. Hey, now let me tell you something that is completely hot off the press. Today I phoned a guy in New Zealand, professor of surgery. I spoke to him, Brian his name is, first time for 43 years. Because when I was a young doctor, I was backpacking around Asia, and I was an angry young man, angry at the church and trying to sort of back out of Christianity because various things made me angry and disillusioned. And I was going through Thailand and I rocked up at this hospital and I think I knew someone there. Anyway, this guy and his wife were working there, he was a surgeon. Well, actually, he was just a regular doctor there. No, he wasn't. He was already a surgeon, that's right. And had dinner with him. And they, and particularly his wife, gave me the most fantastic bit of advice, what to do. You're an angry young man, I suggest here's some, change my life. That's another story. But 2 years later, she and two of the kids were killed in a bus crash. Had a picnic, bus crash, leaving Brian at the hospital. One of the kids survived. And this is what you would call a really bad thing. I wept when I heard it, you know. Anyway, so he had about 4 or 5 years, 6 years, I can't remember now but what he said, but living in a bit of a wilderness. He went to England and tried to go back and work there, but it wasn't the same without her, and he had his son his son had to go to boarding school, and it was all very tricky. And so I'm talking to him, and basically he ended up back in New Zealand. He met someone else, fell in love. They've had a beautiful relationship, had 2 more kids, and his second wife has been totally honouring of his first wife and adopted the first son, just to make it really clear that there was going to be no difference with the kids. And it was a totally beautiful story. And I can just say I don't want this to sound trite, but I've seen a lot of people die. And people think it's the end of the world, but people do really well. And I think Christians are way ahead in this regard. There is a way in which God lifts people up and carries them through, provides hope and comfort in a way that is just kind of hard to describe. Nothing can separate us from the love of Christ. So I'm just going to finish and then open for questions. But my day job, I said that the first thing, remember, was talking about suffering and the natural disasters, and then about the Christian view. And the final one is about, you know, my job as a doctor and telling people they're going to die of cancer. And I want to hopefully give you some practical tips of what to do if you know someone, a family member, what it's like. Because that's, you know, you're probably not going to go and work in the next tsunami, but you are going to know people who have got cancer or some other severe illness or some other suffering. So I'm just going to finish talking about this. Here I am looking at someone's CT scan. I'm a lung specialist, so I do this a lot. Lung cancer is the commonest lethal cancer, so I have to break news, bad news, pretty often. So just talking about dying badly or dying well. So if you can imagine it, for a doctor to have a patient come in and tell them just they're going to die, got 6 months to live, is one of the most poignant, intimate moments of a doctor's whole life. Usually their partner's there, they're crying. It's a very poignant moment. Just imagine if it was you or someone you love. And it's so important to do it as well as you possibly can. There are good ways to do it and there are bad ways to do it. And if you do it well, you can help them on the journey. And if you do it badly, you can seriously wound people. And there's lots of doctors, sadly, who have done it badly and they have left people very wounded. And this is what I call the cancer chair. I was sitting in that chair when I found out my wife had cancer. I got the phone call waiting for my coffee. So these are the questions people ask about it. How do you tell someone they're going to die? And then what do you say? Because they're usually your loved ones with them. What do you say? And how do you, Bruce, cope with doing that so often? That was your question, I think, about the Aceh thing, PTSD kind of stuff. So I'm going to give you another, maybe just 3 minutes this time, to tell the other people at the table, if it was you, how would you like to be told? Okay? Go. What would be important to you about if you had to be the person who was told? What would be important to you? Okay. So the purpose of this exercise is, I guess, to get you to sort of empathise, because if you put yourself in that situation, you can empathise with others more. So let's just go around and see if anyone anyone from this table want to contribute something. Just one thing that you think would be important.
Honesty, honest to be told directly.
Okay.
If it is from the doctor, that is
Yeah.
beautiful.
Okay. This table? Two there, because you've got two.
We had honesty and compassion.
And what would compassion look like?
It's not what it looks like, it's how you deliver the message.
So, but what's in your head when you say that? What would be the style that you would find compassionate?
You're telling someone they've got lung cancer and they've got no hope. Those words wouldn't come out of your mouth. You would say you've got disease, and you would just show compassion that we believe that there's, with a good Christonian, everyone said she should be dead. I don't know if you know Leslie Battaglia. They told her down there when she got lung cancer 20 years ago. You'll be dead within 6 months. She's 20 years as a survivor. She's not well, she's secondaries all the time, but she's still going. So it was with compassion, I think. You can't make a pronouncement that the person's going to die. I think you've got to show compassion when you deliver this horrible news.
Okay. Gustavo? Something?
I suppose we were wondering the difference between a Christian and a non-Christian person, how you'd approach on that basis. That maybe a Christian, you'd be able to be more open and more compassionate with them than a non-Christian who would probably have no idea what's in store when they die.
Yeah, so I'll come back to some of these things, but I might just jump in on that one. So I've had to do this for Christians and non-Christians, and I've got to say that sometimes non-Christians handle the fact that they got bad news a lot better than Christians in various ways. Yeah, it's kind of curious, and some Christians cling white-knuckled to life. But there is another complication with Christians, which is... So I say two things. I say, look, this is the facts, but you might have an extraordinary result, either miraculous, which I believe can happen, or miraculous in response to treatment. That could happen. But we know that mostly it doesn't. And God might say, well done, good and faithful servant, it's your time. You don't understand, you've got teenage kids, but well done, good and faithful servant, I understand it, you're coming to me. Christians sometimes get caught up in the first one and deny the second one. Then they become anyone, like any person who's got cancer, who denies the existence of it, and it makes a problem for their family and it doesn't help them to die well. But as a rule, Christians are easy to talk to. It's true. This table.
We did it differently. It's what do you want to hear from the doctor and what do you want to hear from a friend. The doctor doesn't want to take to the but good. These are the results, this is the prognosis. From a friend, one of the comments was sometimes just believe they don't understand anything.
Good, we'll come to that. Yeah.
Honestly and gentle with delivering news.
Space to process facts, compassion.
Honesty.
Getting the good news, isn't it?
I think we came to the conclusion that we'd quite like to have a reason why they came to that conclusion. The other thing is that they would actually sit down and not be just like, I'm coming in and telling you this out of here, but just sit down as if they get to take some time to deliver the news. Because it's really serious. You don't want to feel like you can't ask questions because they're just like so busy they're dashing. Sorry, I took from experience, as you know.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm an oncology nurse, and we have a lot of doctors who come in, and the way they deliver patients, I've had to report some of them because they're so brutal. You've got to be kind. You've got to sit, give them the time to ask you questions, and be gentle. It's not fair. Yeah.
So I bring this up because it has to do with my favourite topic is weep with those who weep, which is really showing compassion, as you've said. The funny thing about honesty is in the old days, people never used to tell the patients the truth. And when I was courting my wife, it's a funny old word, isn't it, courting, in London, we used to attend a church called All Souls, right in the middle of London. And the vicar, Michael Bourne, said, he told us this story, I've never forgotten it. He went to visit one of his patients in hospital. And as he went in, the family were outside and they said, Michael, he's dying of cancer, but he doesn't know. Whatever you do, don't let on that you know, because the shock would kill him. So he goes in, and the guy, he calls him, he whispers, Michael, I've got cancer, mate. I'm using an Aussie accent. I've got cancer, mate, I'm dying, but whatever they don't know out there, so whatever you do, don't let on, because the shock will kill them. And that's the way people used to do business. And you're right about the prognosis thing. Yeah, exactly. I mean, the best practice is we make time, all the phones are off, there's no hurrying out, sit down, if it's on a bed, usually not in a consulting room, no desk, hand on the shoulder or hold your hand or whatever's appropriate, eye level contact. Yeah, tell them the truth about what the diagnosis is, because usually you've made a deal. You say, look, there's a shadow on the x-ray. I want you to bring your wife in on Friday, we'll get the results. Could be cancer, maybe not, but just want you, if it's okay, bring your wife in or your brother or somebody. I promise I'm going to tell you the truth. They always say yes, thanks. So you tell them. Yeah, let it sink in, and usually the head's in a spin by then. And just stay with it. And only tell them the prognosis if they ask. So look, at this stage we can talk about, of course they want to know what treatment, what's the next steps, but so look, we can talk about the prognosis or not, depending on whether you want to hear it now or not at all, or discuss it later. And the majority want to know what it is, but it's not 6 months. Usually it's there's 25% chance of this and whatever. And here's the thing, and this is why I'm talking about it. It's about weeping with those who weep. So, not so much now, but sometimes I cry. And I used to think, I tell you when I used to cry most was when I had a bloke. So I'll just give you one example. Had a patient who had some fluid on his lung, but he was a young bloke, fit, healthy, and I just thought it was post-pneumonia. And his kids were the same sort of age as my kids, so we got chatting about kids, and I'm sort of totally identifying him as a dad of young kids. I get the result, he's got cancer in his fluid. He's got 6 months to live. So I go and tell him, and he starts to cry. And I start to cry. Absolutely start to cry. Because I'm so identified with these kids who aren't going to have a dad. They're never going to have a dad when they finish school or get married or grandkids, He's crying, I'm crying, and I'm thinking to myself, Bruce, you goose. He is going to think you are an incompetent doctor. You're supposed to be, together. Anyway, he went home. A few weeks later, his GP phoned me. And I honestly thought, here it comes. His GP is going to say, look, thanks, but he doesn't want to, there's no offence. He wants to see someone else, but appreciate everything. He said to me, the GP said, the patient said, well, you're a professor. Actually, I wasn't then. You're an academic. You travel to conferences. He wants to know when you're going to be away. He doesn't want to see anybody else but you. Then I realised how important weeping was. Obviously, you want to be competent, but weeping with those who weep is such a powerful sign of empathy, and this is the Christian model. This is a Christian model, and sometimes it happens, like, I'll tell you this story just come into my head. I'm a patron of a football club, Swan District, you've probably never heard of it, but anyways, way down there. One day the president was leaving and he'd done a great job saving the club from bankruptcy and various things, and the CEO made a speech, and this is all footy club kind of territory. Anyway, he started to say how Jim had saved been very funny, said. Then he said how he'd saved the club and how he'd pulled everyone together, and he got all teary. Shane, his name is. And he got all embarrassed and sort of pulled himself together. And at half-time I said, Shane, great speech, mate. But I noticed you got a bit teary when you were saying what a great guy Jim was. Oh, yeah, he said, I'm so embarrassed. I grabbed his shoulders and looked at him and I said, mate, you have given him a gift, because we can all talk in the footy club about this and that, but you cried, and that was a wonderful gift, because that really showed him what you really thought of him. He's going to Victoria, he's going to take that little bit of knowledge with him. It was a wonderful thing you did for him. And I thought, funny you didn't even know that. There's something about tears that you can't fake. Well, you can fake it, but probably not. I'm sure actors fake it. And in terms of what I've just been telling you tonight, like I don't like to give explanations, but just to weep with those who weep. I was talking to a young doctor who I taught as a medical student. Just ran into this person, had coffee. She told me, details don't matter, that something that had gone wrong and in her life, and she didn't get a really good reception from some Christians around the place, and she was struggling with some bad vibes. I just started to cry at the table. I didn't explain anything or do anything. I just started to cry, and I thought, it's probably the best I can do. And I guess that's just what I'm trying to say, weep with those who weep. Anyway, just to finish off, I want to say one thing about human beings and their capacity to live with grief. There's a tendency nowadays to think we have to have a perfect life, but in the history of the human species, we have not had a perfect life. Grief has been always part of our existence. So you think about so here we have someone's heart, right? And in the heart, we get wounded in our heart. We carry that grief in our heart for the whole of our lives. It is inescapable. Here's a kid doing a few drugs. Here's a girl, she's got depression. We worry about our kids and we have grief about them. Here's a marriage, the sort of wedding day, but it never pans out exactly as you thought. And so many people have grief about their marriage. They had so many hopes that have a Cinderella-type marriage, but it doesn't work out, whether they're still together or not. Maybe they're suffering depression themselves or some disability. Something about work, work gets meaningless, or is this what I studied and worked so hard for? It's kind of boring and it's got no meaning. And finally, people carry grief. I have this phrase, I've seen it so often. It goes, scratch the surface of any middle-aged person and you will find grief. About something, one of these things or something, their parents have died or dying or, and you think about it, until this generation or the previous generation, everyone lost or typically lost at least one child. You go to the graveyard, you look at the history books. People would have 8 kids and lose 2 or 3 of them from scarlet fever or smallpox or all sorts of things. No antibiotics. And we've just said earlier on that the death of a child would be for me and maybe for you, the most difficult grief. Well, people have lived with that sort of grief forever. Read the books of the history of the pioneers, etc. And, husbands lost their wives in childbirth all over the place. No antibiotics. And then wives lost their husbands, in accidents or wars or sailing ship, the sailing ship sinks or trauma on the farm, etc. And if you read the history of the human species, people have carried grief around in their hearts forever. So it's not the end of the world. It doesn't break your heart, it's just in your heart. And the thing about grief in your heart is it can make you, there's a famous phrase that we use in medicine. Actually, you probably hear this in oncology. Grief handled badly makes people bitter, but grief handled well makes people better. And you all can be people who can help people. You can either help to make them bitter, and those people you're talking about, when doctors break bad news, that's the start of a bitterness journey. And you only have to turn on the news, the TV, to know what bitterness is like. But grief handled well makes people better. They get softer and warmer. And this is one of the mysteries of it all. And the Bible's very clear on this, that all this stuff carried in your heart can actually work together to make you a person more empathic and more resilient. And it's a curious and it's unsatisfactory in a lot of ways when you're feeling it all, but this can make you... I've seen it so often, seen it so often. So finally, 4 practical tips. And thanks very much for talking about the difference between a patient and family. So this is 4 practical tips. So we've moved on to the practical side of all this now. No more bodies in the street, no more biblical verses. This is just some practical tips for how you can engage with people who are suffering. So one thing is to listen, and we always have an urge to speak, I think. When there's a silence or there's this compulsive urge to speak. And this is the worst one, to theologize. Sorry, I shouldn't laugh. Please, if you get tempted to theologize too early when someone's suffering and weeping, no, please don't do it. And don't use cliches. Make it a cliche-free zone. Cliches, like, what's an example of some cliches? Like, well, maybe the doctors have got it wrong, or I saw something on Catalyst, or she'll be right, move on, snap out of it, all that sort of stuff. Secondly, empathise. This is really important, and I've got to say, this is really important in churches. It's not about you. So you have your grief and your fear, but it's not about you. It's about the other person. And the way people do this in a selfish way is to sort of, they've got grief, so they say, well, I've prayed for you and I'm sure God's going to heal you. Actually, that doesn't help people. That's often about you. There's a lot of stuff like that. It's not about you. It's about them and how they are feeling. They've got to get into their shoes. I was recently at a church on the East Coast. Actually, and 2 years ago I'd spoken at this church. Big church, got 4 places. Doesn't really matter, but anyway, the wife interviewed me. The husband and wife pastoral team. The wife interviewed me, and she'd had breast cancer. And 2 things I remember about this is they've become good friends of ours, so, and they won't mind me saying this. See, this is a charismatic church, and there's a lot of faith about healing. And she, when people said to her, "Oh, I've had a word from God that you're going to be healed," she had to say, "Please stop. I can't take any more. Please, whatever your sense of this is, please keep it to yourself." Because she realised they were sort of, a lot of it was about them. I mean, it sounds good. Actually, let me tell you what the husband told me over lunch. So his wife's very well known, but she was having chemo, so he had to go to America to some conference without her. And so everybody asked him how she was. Relentlessly. He said, "Bruce, this is deeply poignant. I couldn't get out of my head. This is about who cares for the carer. And this is really important to know." He said, "I felt like I was standing in a paddock, getting relentlessly pecked by crows, and I had nowhere to go." How's Darlene? How's Darlene? How's Darlene? How's Darlene? How's Darlene? At St Matthew's, where I mostly attend, I had this sort of 2-minute rule. So when Jackie, my wife, was having chemo, and my friend Michael Hodgkin's daughter, she had a sort of leukemia type thing, was also having treatment. When there was like the 2-minute warning, in sport they have 2-minute warning, basketball, etc. 2 minutes to go, he and I, you'd see us disappearing from the church. Because after church, how's Jackie, how's Jackie, how's Jackie, how's Jackie, how's Jackie, how's Jackie, how's Jackie? Like 15, 20 minutes, everyone, I'm thinking, can't you think of something else to say? And they're just being kind, right? It's just that it's brutal. Really important thing to know about empathy. That you would walk up to someone and think, well, I wonder what's already been said and how can I really think about them rather than being lazy, I guess.
Interesting, my daughter, she's amazing, that if ever I'm really sad and I say something, she'll always say to me, "I'm so sorry, Mum." And it's just not that, come fix you, just those words, "I'm just so sorry, Mum." It's not nice. It's just like something like that, if people can just say that rather than I'd always fix it. The fixing of, is always the most important.
But fixing is usually about the fixer. That's a lovely thing. Yeah, I'm not naturally good at all this stuff. I remember when I was young, I used to be one of these snap out of it, move on, pull yourself together kind of people. And I'm grateful for medicine for lots of things. One is that I would engage so closely with suffering and just see how a better way to do it. And as a Christian, having an open mind that there's a better way to do it, and honestly, being like Jesus. One of the interesting things I was just thinking about today, I told you before that I was backing out of the faith and was an angry young man and dropped out of the church for a few years. Never once did I find Jesus unattractive in all of that. So powerful, yet so humble and so compassionate. It's hard not to be attracted to Jesus, just as probably kept me in. Third thing is avoid avoidance. Patients of mine, they go home. I say after a month, come back after a month. How many people have been to see you? None. They don't know what to say. They're afraid they're going to say the wrong thing, so they don't call in, they don't do anything. Or they come along and they talk about anything else but their cancer. And then they say, well, I'm going to pray for you. And we have this phrase, it sounds terribly unspiritual, prayer is not enough. One of the things about the Bible is that prayer is not enough. You have to actually do something. If you can do something, well, if you're in a plane and the wings fall off, obviously prayer's all you got, but you can't glue the wings back on. But if you can reach out in empathy, or if you can do something, you actually have a responsibility to do it. Prayer is not enough. And prayer is a mechanism of avoidance for a lot of people. And do stuff. One of the commonest phrases is, oh, if there's anything I can do. Well, don't do that. Go and do something. Say, what day do you want me to pick kids up? When am I doing shopping for you? When can I mow your lawn? Just give me a date. And you say, if I'm going to do the shopping for you, I'm happy to leave it on the... You don't have to sort of come in and make me a cup of tea and talk to me. I'm happy to leave it on the porch if you'd rather. Just be honest and say that, or just leave it on the porch. I can tell you before and after story where how you deal with suffering can make a big difference. A lady came to see me and she had a cough or something. I felt her abdomen, which I always do, and she had a big liver. Bottom line is she had terminal bowel cancer. So she then went off to somebody else. But she came back to see me because once I start seeing someone who got cancer, I always stay the hub of the wheel. It helps in their continuity. I said, how are you going? She said, I want to die now. I said, oh, you got a lot of pain? She said, no, I don't have pain, but my husband can't handle the grief. And he's really angry. He's sort of going through the anger stage of grief, and he's snapping at everybody, and it's terrible. And my son can't stand that, so he's moved in with his girlfriend. And now my husband says he's living in sin right at the time when I'm dying, etc. And the worst thing is, my daughter, who's a hairdresser, she doesn't live at home, but she comes in every night and expects me to make cups of tea, which I'm happy to do, but she never talks about my cancer. And my husband's furious. He thinks she should make the cup of tea, she should make the dinner, she should at least talk about the cancer. Bruce, I want to die. Miraculously, a few weeks later, I was having my hair cut. And one thing I remembered about this daughter was that she scuba dived. And this hairdresser was talking about scuba diving. And I'm thinking, oh, how could this be? I thought, what's the chances? In any case, there's a hairdressing salon full of people. What about confidentiality? You know, we're sort of indoctrinated into that. And I'm sitting there having this conversation with myself, clip, clip, clip. I'm thinking, well, can't make it any worse because she wants to die. So I said, can I ask you a question? You're not Mrs. So-and-so's daughter, eh? Yes, I am. Anyway, long story short, organised someone to get in there, and I didn't do it, get in there and family counselling. Got them all talking and holding hands and crying. Anyway, she ended up in the hospice and I went to see her. She said, Bruce, I don't know what you said to my daughter, but it's miraculous. My husband's not angry anymore and my son's moved home. My daughter, she comes to the hospice and does my hair every week. It's such a beautiful story of before and after. The difference being empathy and communication, all these things. And you can be an agent for that, for people that you know. And you can help them die well, not die badly. And I'm going to finish with this favourite. This guy's one of my favourites. Anyone know who he is? Nope. Christopher Hitchens. Now, he was a brilliant, articulate, smart journalist. But he wrote a book called God Is Not Great, and he became one of the sort of poster child atheists, an evangelistic atheist who could see nothing good in Christianity, who called If you're a person who teaches your kids Christianity, you are child abusing them. Interesting, his brother is a Christian. Now, there's lots of things about Christopher Hitchens, but something happened that in his life, his mother was one of these sort of flighty people. Anyway, she left his dad and she ran off with a poet of some sort. And they were travelling around Europe, and arty sort of alternative bohemian, whatever. Anyway, she committed suicide, a dual suicide with a boyfriend in Athens. So he went there to sort things out. And he had to sort of get her buried, right? So he contacted the local Protestant pastor. And the local Protestant pastor said, I'm not sure we can bury her because, number one, she's living in adultery, and number two, she took her own life. Christopher Hitchens was absolutely ropeable. Now, I'm not saying that that's the reason he was the arch enemy of Christianity, but here's what I am saying, and I'm just going back to the weep with those who weep. If it had been Jesus, he would have said, let's go, I'll buy you a beer. He would have wept with him, put his arm around him, sat with him, talked to him. All the things we know about Jesus. And this guy, who was the Protestant pastor, preached a false gospel to him. Just like priests who abuse kids are preaching a false gospel. And we are asked to be, as Christians, his ambassadors and his aroma. So that guy was a bad ambassador and a bad smell. And I think it's just terribly, terribly sad. Now let me focus on the positive. Focusing on the positive. I'd love to have been the guy. Maybe if I'd been in the same hotel and seen him, I'd have taken him out for a beer. And if you wanted just to have a beer all night and, I don't know, whatever, walk around the streets, stay with him. And weep. And if he wanted to, like the guy in Darwin, it's like if he wanted to be angry at God and swear at God, just to let him do it. And just keep weeping and putting your arm around him and being Jesus to people. And I think, I guess the whole theme of my presentation here is that there's, suffering's going to happen and we're all going to engage with it. And whilst there are the 5 ins that explain Christianity and what its view of suffering is, they're pretty unsatisfactory to someone. Just weep with those who weep. And that means more than, it means all of these things. Okay, one more thing, this is my last slide. What I find, and maybe you do, for those who are Christians, if you're not a believer here, then take this however you want to take it. But as I said, I think Jesus has always been very attractive. But I feel like the days when you could knock on someone's emotional front door and say, well, I want to talk to you about Christianity. That door is bolted shut with double deadlocks and, planks hammered. You never get in. And the more we hear about child abuse and things, the harder it is, and Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins. But unquestionably, if anyone is like Jesus and shows and weeps with those who weep and shows empathy and kindness and all the things that are exactly what Jesus is like, you'll be invited in the back door. You'll be invited in the back door. And this is a phrase I use a lot. Behold, I stand at the back door and knock. Embodying the compassion of Jesus. Anyway, I've finished. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bruce. We've got just a little something for you as well, just a card to say thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
I think we advertised this finishing at 9 o'clock, so of course it's already 1:45. If it's late, thank you very much for coming this evening, but I think we would have a bit of time for questions as well if we wanted to do that. And then there's still, no one's hardly touched the snacks, so hopefully that would go on as well. Any questions?
Yeah, I've got, I'm pretty blessed not to have much suffering in my life, but I've got 2 friends who suffer in different ways. And the one particular you've hit on a few times, but I wanted to get your thoughts further is a woman friend of mine whose husband had ALS, and he passed away about 6-9 months ago. And she told me when I met with her recently how she's very often the church they were going to, they were praying for healing, like you said, the constant kind of God will heal you, God will heal him. And she talked about how he was convinced until the end that he would be healed because they were praying with these people for healing, and she was convinced as well. And her reflection on me as she was having this conversation was, I don't know anyone who's been healed from ALS. In that sense, that was her statement to me. And a lot of what you said, I listened and did all those stuff. But I guess it's something we've hit on a little bit, but not exactly. How do we as Christians or church people or whatever kind of respond, or what's your response or understanding of that? The kind of some people who have that kind of very passion for God will heal you. You will be healed.
Yeah, so just for people, ALS is a neurological disorder, like a multiple sclerosis, but not quite. It's a So I can tell you what I say to patients, and I sort of alluded to it earlier on.
Yeah.
So let's, a Christian, right? It may be that you're miraculously healed, or that God's going to say, well done, good and faithful servant. If the second one is the case, you need to prepare for that. So I would say, if I'm allowed to say it, I mean, sometimes people just run off and into their cocoon and assume they're going to be healed and have people praying, and they deny the existence of the cancer and deny their family and friends all the goodbyes and closures and things that make dying well make them die well. So I would say, for example, I'd say always, plan for the worst and hope for the best. So you hope you're going to be healed or get a miraculous response, but plan for the worst. Planning for the worst, just let me be clear about this because it's quite poignant, is, they've always wanted to go to Paris or Uluru or Antarctica or somewhere, so go. Wait, and then go and just do it. And here's the hard one. They're not going to see their kids grow up, not going to walk their daughter down the aisle, right? So write them a letter, carefully worded letter about affirming them, and so they can open it on their wedding day, open it on their 16th birthday, etc. Well, can you imagine writing that sort of letter? It has a miraculous effect because, of course, it makes them accept reality as a possibility. But after they've written that letter, they feel terribly liberated because now every day is a gift. So if they could live 3 months, but there's like a 5% chance they could be alive in 5 years, they hope for the 5% 5 years, but they write their letter while they're really well without morphine on board and all that sort of stuff. And it's a wonderful thing to see because they start noticing after that they've never noticed how blue the sky is. And look at that tree. I've never noticed how green that tree is before. And, they start talking to people. And so that's how I do it. And I do that with Christians because you can see that mostly people aren't healed. And I think to cling to the idea you are going to be healed, it's not helpful. And a lot of it's about the person saying it, and it causes people to avoid all those wonderful things that can happen if you die well. So I spend extra time doing that, and I used to say I had a 100% success rate. I reckon it's 98%. I got it wrong once where someone didn't, they realised it was true but didn't like it, kind of shoot the messenger, but anyway.
I guess my follow-up would be, what if I see this person again and have a conversation, what would or should I say now?
Oh, it's hard to say without knowing the person and how receptive they are, and you do need a bit of experience to be able to talk to people.
I mean, I went with your kind of listen as much as you can, say as little as you can.
But I do think that the phrase "well done, good and faithful servant" is useful. God clearly says that, and when it's time, it's time.
Yeah. And it was tough in this case with the guilt, really, for this person. So. Anyways, I think that thing about the healing is a very common one that I see and hear in many churches that I connect with, which is a shame in some ways.
So that church I told you about 2 years ago, I spoke about suffering 2 weeks ago. This time the husband, the guy picked by crows, was doing the interviewing from the stand, and it was very interesting to look at the congregation, as we talked about his wife, co-pastor, and him, and you know how hard it was for him, and their eyes were on stalks as they thought, gee, we could have done this a whole lot better. We could have been better at looking out for you.
Bruce, what's your view on euthanasia, which is in the topics now that's coming up?
Yeah, I don't. In general, I find that people who are interested in euthanasia are being badly managed. You know, you can die well and you can die badly. And if you're dying badly, you're in pain or you're breathless or people are angry or, you know, all that sort of stuff. A bit like the patient I told you about, she wanted to die. She probably would have taken euthanasia to get away from her grumbling husband. Well, I got that sense, you know, if it was around then. But she's an example of someone, if you manage them well, there's a nice way to exit the world. And I think if you've got muscular dystrophy or a motor neurone disease or a multiple sclerosis where, you know, things are just deteriorating, becomes a bit harder. But again, there's a better way to do it. And if people are getting good care, it's usually, most of this stuff's a reflection of poor care. I do appreciate that there are some times when that's not the case, and I find that a bit of a conundrum, but I'm not someone who supports it as we stand.
If a person tells you that their child's about to die, or the child has died recently in an accident, is it comforting to talk to that person about the same grief that you've had?
No. Well, actually, I was thinking today again about a medical student who I taught how to break bad news, and she actually had that job. 1 week out of medical school, she was working in the emergency department, and a guy came in and his 8-year-old daughter had died in a crash. She had to tell him, and she had to tell a guy his 8-year-old daughter was dead and to be with him in that. And she said to them, I'm only a week out of medical school, get someone who's experienced to do it. And they were all busy with cardiac arrest and pulmonary emboli, and so she had to do it. And she did exactly that. She remembered that listening was a good idea, like number one. So she sat there and listened and didn't feel the urge to speak. And she started to cry when she was leaving. And same thing again that happened to me. The dad just rattled on about his daughter and running home from school with a prize and everything and just all the grief stuff. And she just stayed with him. And then she started to cry. And she, like me, she thought she'd messed it up, blubbering away. And the dad apparently phoned the hospital and specifically asked that she be thanked. What a great job she'd done. Yeah, so she didn't say, oh, this happened to me, or you're like someone else. It's actually unhelpful. I mean, you know that phrase, you say, I know how you feel. That's such a terrible thing to say. You never know. Even if you've also lost an 8-year-old daughter, it's just not the same. Yeah, silence, empathy, just crying, it's just a beautiful thing to do. And as Louisa said, you know, not in a hurry to get out of the room. Most people are in a hurry, doctors as well, get out of the room.
Can I ask you, like, when you were working in Aceh and you had like everybody was sick and dying, how do you cope with that and still be able to do your job? Because you can't cry with everybody. Then you're not able to do your work.
Yeah, I didn't do much crying. I didn't do any crying actually during the day. I mean, you're pretty busy. I did cry at night sometimes, shut the door, weep. I don't know, just get up. Well, you know, it's nice being with the team, you know, because they have a good sense of humour. And then you just get out and work, and in the end, you just get into the rhythm of it. I think I felt more sad for people, at night when I was going to bed and thinking about it, or before I went, or when I came home, even tonight as I think about it. But when you're there, you're just working.
You didn't feel burnt out by all that death you were in?
No, not. No, it was more the sadness. I mean, there's a million people who lost. You know, it was like a black cloud of sadness. There was no colour in the markets. It's just all ruin. You know, and this like black cloud of sadness everywhere. You're walking through this black cloud of sadness, and yeah, it was a slight problem that we realised we had to talk to them and start to take on their stories, you know, and then we shared them back at the base, and you know, it was pretty hard. I think if you're busy, it sort of helps, I think.
Bruce, with all the people that you have to break this discover they've got that hand in the news that you're getting?
Yeah, it's slightly tricky. Mostly I say, what sort of support have you got? Like, you know, what sort of family support or community, church, whatever. That's how I do my soundings on it, because it's unethical to invade their space with something inappropriate like that, especially in the public hospital. So I do soundings like that, and then we either do or don't have that discussion.
Once you discover that, do you see any difference in the way that a believer reacts?
Yeah, like I was saying before. Yeah, it's like I said before, it's kind of mixed, and I've seen lots of non-believers die well along the lines we just talked about, and Christians who've been afraid. You know, like it's about fear, mostly fear and loss, fear of loss, and fear. And a lot of people are scared of dying. I'm not actually scared of dying. I don't know how many people are here. I say to my kids, like most of my analogies have to do with sport for some obvious reason to do with my life. But anyway, I say to my kids, look, know this. To me, life is like a game of cricket. I'm out there batting, and I'm not blocking all day long and hoping that in the last session I'm going to play some shots. I'm playing my shots the whole time, because you never know when you're going to get the unplayable delivery that's going to knock you out. And when I do, I'm going to walk back to that pavilion with a bat under my arm, take my gloves off, smiling, because I've had a real good go, and the next guy will come in, I'll say, mate, I've had a good go, it's your turn. And I say that to my kids so that they don't think I'm clinging white-knuckled to life. I'm not afraid of dying. I've had a great life. I've really lived life. I see life as a gift. And that's how I think Christians should see it. I mean, if they're only 33 and they're going to die, that's had 33 years of gift. You know, if they have a child who's 13 who's going to die, or that's 13 years as a gift you've had. Yeah, it doesn't always work out. There's some Christians are dominated by fear and avoidance and all those things that stop them dying well. And it pays out on their kids. It pays out on the survivors afterwards, and it can lead to bitterness and resentment and all sorts of things. Anger. Anger at the person who's died usually. Or sometimes anger at the doctor, or, you know, whatever.
Woody Allen says he's not afraid to die, he just doesn't want to be there when it happens.
I read a great thing. This is a bit of a naughty one, but about forgiveness. It's not very Christian, but I'll tell you anyway. Norman Schwarzkopf was asked whether he had any capacity for forgiveness of the 9/11 terrorists who killed, you know, a few thousand people. He said, "That's not my job." He said, "That's God's job. My job is to arrange the meeting." Sorry, I shouldn't have said that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bruce, for coming. Yeah, thank you all as well. This is Reasonable Faith Perth, and our next meeting is November 7th, Wednesday night as well, here from 7 to